Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
It was on a raw November evening, when the fog lay in livid folds across Baker Street and the lamps glowed like sullen coals behind their sooted glass, that we received the singular visit which drew Holmes into what I still consider among the most confounding of his inquiries. I had been at my practice until late, 1 or 2 influenza cases, a sprained wrist from a tradesman's mishap, and a child with the croup, so that I came home more inclined to slippers than to mysteries. Yet as I threw aside my greatcoat in our familiar sitting-room at number 221B, the air of alert expectancy upon Holmes's lean features warned me that a case, like a hawk upon the glove, waited to be flown. He was in the attitude I knew so well. Stretched upon the settee, fingertips together, his aquiline profile rising and falling against the gas jet's flicker, eyes half-lidded but very much awake. Upon the table near him lay a beeswax candle, burnt to a shallow stump, its wick congealed into a curious twist. Beside it, a French match-safe in brass, a torn scrap of grey ribbon, and a small spill of pale blue grease upon a visiting card. The card itself bore a coronet, and the name Sir Percival Ashe, Baronet, a figure known to all readers of the morning papers for his philanthropy, his patronage of certain religious charities in Southwark, and his taste for small but brilliant music-halls at his Belgravia residence. "You are late, Watson," said Holmes without looking at me, "and your last patient gave you anxiety. The child's cough has abated, however, or you would not smell faintly of camphor and relief in equal measure." "I protest that I am inexpressibly simple to you," said I, falling into my chair. "What is this?" I gestured at the eccentric assemblage on the table. "The spectres of reason dressed as trifles," Holmes returned. "We shall have their explanation shortly. Our visitor has sent for Inspector Lestrade, and when those nimble feet reach my stairs, we shall have the official garnish to our dish." As if to cue the footman in a theatre, there came the brisk beat of boots, and Lestrade himself burst in, narrow, eager, and a little damp. "Evening, Mr. Holmes, Doctor. I've taken the liberty." He shook the fog from his hat. "It's the Ashe business. Sir Percival found dead in his study an hour after 10. No marks of violence to speak of. Door locked on the inside, window bolted, and the key in his own waistcoat pocket. The doctor on the scene says heart failure, but—" He made a gesture of baffled distaste. "There's something that don't answer." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Pray sit, Lestrade. Begin at the beginning and be exact." Lestrade perched, producing a little notebook. "Belgrave Square. Staff heard the dinner gong at 8. Sir Percival dined alone. A habit. At 9:30, he retired to his study, small room off the music salon. He habitually sat to write his correspondence by the light of a single candle, beeswax, as you see. At 10 o'clock, one Mr. Alastair Venn, musical gentleman, cello player, arrives for a rehearsal. He passes through the salon and, on his way to the study door, sees Sir Percival's silhouette, clear as can be, sitting at the writing desk with the candle between his face and the door. "That's the curious part, a living outline," says Venn, steady as if the man were breathing. But when he knocks, no answer. The butler tries, no answer. They force the door. Sir Percival's dead as Hannibal's elephant. Cold, too, dead longer than a few minutes. And yet Mr. Venn swears he had just seen the man's shadow thrown against the panel by the candle flame. "Ah," murmured Holmes, and his fingers tapped together. "Death, and yet an image of life behind the candle flame." "You've read the evening bill?" Lestrade looked up, surprised. "I've read your face, my dear fellow," Holmes said, not unkindly. "Proceed." "Dr. Hale, the local man, says no struggle, no poison he can find at a glance. There's wax spattered on the desk blotter, though not a drop down the candle itself, which is odd to me. The mantel clock stopped at 17 minutes past 9, overwound or something. Hale says perhaps Sir Percival touched it. Windows latched. A bell pull to the corridor is cut halfway down, as if hacked with a penknife. And there's a queer smell, like powder and violets, the housemaid says. Orris root, Holmes observed. And the blue smear? Lestrade made a face. Theatrical grease paint, Mr. Holmes. Mayfair's not so far from the boards, and Sir Percival had artists in and out for those musicales. We found that smear upon a calling card tray, as if someone wiped a finger there. Also this. He produced, with the gravity of a conjurer, a tiny brass disc no larger than a shilling, with serrations along one edge. Looks like a striker from a match safe. The safe itself is on the desk, but its striker plate is missing. Holmes's gaze flitted to the stump of beeswax on our table. The faintest smile, dangerously thin, appeared and vanished upon his lips. A candle that drips nowhere it should, a clock that obediently dies before its master, a bell pull silenced by a careful hand, and a dead man whose shadow performs after the curtain. If we add a scent to mask a second scent, we have the beginning of a play. Then you'll come? Lestrade asked. Holmes rose in a single elastic movement. We will come now. Watson, your coat. Lestrade, secure for me any statements already taken, particularly from Mr. Alistair Venn, from the butler, whose name is Jervis, been with the family 20 years. From Jervis, from Sir Percival's secretary if he kept one, and from the housemaid with the discriminating nose. Detain any person who attempts to leave, politely, Inspector, and for heaven's sake have no one touch the candle, the clock, or the bell pull until I have had the pleasure. There is an energy that comes upon Holmes like quicksilver when a puzzle catches his fancy. I have seen lethargy fall from him as a husk, leaving the vibrant, analytical spirit within. So it was now. In a trice we were in a handsome, rattling south and west, the fog making ghostly islands of the lamps, the horse's breath smoking like a dragon's in the cold. You have a theory, I ventured, for I know well that silence at such times is more fruitful than chatter, but his eyes had that inward look which suggests a composition forming. I have a direction, he said at last. Our Mr. Venn is no fool. He saw a shadow. A shadow is an absence, a theft of light. If one wishes to counterfeit life, one may arrange the theft artistically. Consider, Watson, the relationship between a single flame, a panelled door, and a figure seated between the two. Consider, too, how the wax could spatter nowhere near the candle, and how a striker might part company from its case. Lastly, ask yourself why a man beloved of charities chooses to cut his own bell pull. You suggest suicide? I cried. Holmes's lip curled. You suggest it, my dear fellow. I deny it. Suicide is a coarse brush. This is pointillism. Belgrave Square loomed upon us, porticoed, stately, and, that night, unnaturally hushed. A constable stood at the gate. Within, a second uniformed man, his boots squeaking on stone. The great house opened its mouth to us with the solemnity of mourning. We were shown through the marble hall, past a gilt-framed portrait of a stern Tudor gentleman, and into a salon where a cello lay mute upon its side, one string snapped like a nerve. A faint residual fragrance, powder, and violets indeed, hung in the air. Jervis, the butler, met us with that self-control which is the Englishman's second religion. Inspector, gentlemen, Sir Percival has left us. Holmes's bow was both grave and penetrating. Our sympathies. Your master dined at 8? Yes, sir. A chop and a glass of claret. And after dinner? The study, sir, as is his wont. He writes his letters before bed. Did he receive callers this afternoon? A Mr. Venn rehearsed from 5 until near 7, sir, A Miss Lydia Ashe, Sir Percival's niece, took tea at 4, and a gentleman from the Suffolk Parish Relief Society brought papers to be signed. Holmes's eyelids lowered. Names, addresses, times, we shall have them. And now, if you please, the study. Let no one precede us. We approached the small door of the salon, panelled in dark walnut. The very sight of it produced a curious thrill in me, as if a theatre's curtain were about to lift. Holmes paused, raised his chin, and surveyed the corridor and the adjacent walls with that minute attention which has so often seemed to me almost superhuman. He bent to examine the lower moulding, traced with a finger the faint line where a draught had teased the dust, and then, with a nod to Lestrade, stepped into the room where Sir Percival Ashe, philanthropist and host, had kept his last appointment, with death sitting patiently behind a candle flame. The study into which we were ushered struck me at once as the sort of room which revealed its master's character with every panelled wall. Dark oak shelves were lined with volumes on theology, classical music, and the social question, but nowhere the lighter reading or works of fiction which so often soften a man's countenance. A neat writing desk occupied the centre, with a blotter, the brass match-safe, and the stump of candle standing like an accusing witness upon its silver holder. Sir Percival's body had been removed, but the chair where he had sat remained pulled close, and a square indentation in the carpet betrayed where his shoes had rested. The single tall window, latticed and bolted, looked upon a fog-bound square, and the room carried that strange mingling of presence and absence that always attends a sudden death. Holmes did not go directly to the desk, but began at the periphery, moving like a cat in measured steps. He crouched to examine the skirting boards, ran his long fingers along the bell-pull cord, which dangled truncated against the wall, and held his magnifying lens to the cut fibres. He uttered a soft, satisfied hum. "Clean, deliberate, and executed with something sharper than the average pocket-knife," he murmured. "See, Watson, the ends fray, not but compress, as if pinched inwards by a keen, narrow blade. A surgeon's scalpel, or a theatrical trick-knife, perhaps. Curious indeed." He then drew up before the mantelpiece where the little ormolu clock stood still at 17 minutes past 9. Removing the glass dome, he turned the hands gently forward, listening to the faint complaint of its spring. "Overwound, yes, but not haphazardly. The tension is too carefully equalized. Someone wished this time to stand, Watson, as if to fix the scene at a precise moment." Meanwhile, Lestrade busied himself with his notebook. "I've put the maid and the secretary in a side room. Mr. Venn has been kept under watch. He's sulking at being doubted, but I dare say he'll wait till morning. What do you make of the candle, Mr. Holmes? Dr. Hale swears it's queer." Holmes bent over the silver holder. The wax had indeed spilled upon the blotter, yet the stub itself remained smooth, without the telltale drippings down its length. He lifted it delicately with a pair of tweezers he produced from his pocket-case. "Note this, Watson. The wax upon the blotter lies scattered, as if spattered from without, not wept downward from the wick. Observe the rim, untouched, perfect. The flame burned steady, the spatter came from another source entirely, and yet the wick is crooked, twisted unnaturally, suggesting that it was tampered with after the wax had cooled." "You mean someone imitated the candle's labour?" I asked. "Precisely, and consider. A candle flame properly placed will project a silhouette if a body obstructs its light. But if one seeks to project the likeness of a body no longer capable of sitting upright, one might contrive the flame and the shadow by other means. A spattered blotter may tell of sudden heat, an artificial glare, Watson, as from a chemical preparation. Let us not decide yet, but hold the thought." Lestrade gave a snort of scepticism. "You're saying the gentleman was dead before Venn knocked, and someone made his shadow look alive?" Holmes's eyes glittered. I suggest only that shadows are obedient servants. They tell no lies but those we make them tell. And Sir Percival's own habits, the locked door, the missing striker plate, all play their part in a tale which is not yet written. He turned sharply to the walls and held up his magnifying lens near the panels opposite the candle. Yes, see here. A faint scorching, Watson, delicate as a moth's wing. Something was held close, some luminous effect which would throw an outline against the door for Mr. Venn to observe. The candle was an accomplice, not the author. Lestrade whistled low. Then it's a staged death, not a natural one. But why go to such lengths? If a man drops of heart failure, there's no need to mimic him alive. Unless, said Holmes gravely, one wished to establish an alibi. Picture it. The visitor sees Sir Percival's living silhouette at 10 o'clock. Therefore, any crime must have occurred after. Yet, if our philanthropist had been dead half an hour already, the guilty party enjoys immunity, the clock and shadow both testifying falsely to his continued existence. It was at that moment that the door opened softly, and Jervis, the butler, stood with a face composed but anxious. Inspector, the young lady insists. Miss Lydia Ashe. She begs to speak with you and with Mr. Holmes if he will permit it. Holmes glanced swiftly at Lestrade, then at me. Let her come. A family member, particularly one with an interest in her uncle's estate, may unwittingly furnish more than she intends. A moment later she entered, a young woman of no more than 25, dressed plainly in mourning black, though the calamity was scarcely 2 hours old. Her eyes, dark and earnest, flicked from Lestrade to Holmes, then to me, as though seeking reassurance. My uncle was not well, gentlemen, she began in a low voice. I feared this would come. Yet the manner, it is dreadful, whispered already in the servants' hall as murder. You will discover the truth? Holmes inclined his head. We shall endeavour, Miss Ashe. May I ask, did your uncle quarrel recently with any of his acquaintances or deny any request for aid that might have embittered the petitioner? She hesitated. Uncle Percival was charitable, yes, but he was not indulgent. Only last week he refused funds to a Mr. Godfrey Pike, a theatrical man who claimed a scheme to aid orphans with his performances. My uncle suspected him a rogue. They exchanged words. Mr. Pike grew angry. He left with threats. Holmes's fingers drummed lightly on the mantel. A theatrical man, you say? And familiar with stage properties, perhaps even grease paint? The young lady's gaze lifted in startled comprehension. Yes, sir. He bore upon his cuffs a smudge, blue, I remember, for I had been sketching that very colour. Holmes smiled thinly. Your recollection is most valuable. Pray compose yourself, Miss Ashe. You have aided us more than you know. As she withdrew, Holmes leaned close to B. Blue grease paint, Watson, the very smear upon the visiting card tray. Add to it the cut bell pull, the spattered blotter, and the counterfeit shadow. We have before us a hand skilled in illusion, one who thrives by deceiving the eye. Whether it was Mr. Pike himself or another of his craft, the play was staged here for an audience of one, the cello player, whose testimony secures the false hour of death. Lestrade looked unconvinced, though less so than before. It's a beginning, Mr. Holmes, I'll grant you that. But I'll want more than grease paint and scorched panelling to put a rope round a man's neck. You shall have more, Holmes said softly. For when men attempt the theatre of crime, they forget that every stage leaves its dust, every illusion its seam. And I, Lestrade, have always held a season ticket. Holmes lingered in the study long after Miss Ashe had withdrawn, his eyes darting with restless brilliance from one corner to another. He moved with the quick, bird-like motions I had learned to recognize as his mind arranging fragments into patterns. though he spoke little. Lestrade, meanwhile, paced impatiently, his boots squeaking against the polished floorboards. For my own part, I could not remove from my mind the odd combination of elements already before us: the cut bell pull, the spattered wax, the frozen clock, and that uncanny testimony of a living shadow cast by a man who was already dead. At last Holmes stooped at the desk and drew the blotter closer, holding it under his lens. "Do you observe, Watson, these faint, circular marks pressed into the paper? Not ink, not wax, but the indentation of some small metallic object with ridges. Now compare them to this." He picked up the tiny brass disc Lestrade had shown us earlier. "They are of a piece. The striker plate was not merely lost. It was pressed forcibly upon the blotter, as though part of an experiment in light and shadow. I suspect our criminal rehearsed his art here, testing the angle of reflection before committing the act itself." "But to what end?" I asked. "Surely a simple blow or poison would suffice if the intention was to murder." Holmes's smile was enigmatic. "Murderers are often prosaic, Watson, but occasionally they are artists. This hand craved not only success but flourish. Imagine the vanity of a man who wishes the very circumstances to applaud his cleverness: a locked door, a living silhouette, a false hour of death. Such theatrics narrow our list of suspects most conveniently." Lestrade cleared his throat. "All very pretty, Mr. Holmes, but it's speculation till we tie it to flesh and blood. What of Mr. Venn, the cello player? He swears to seeing the shadow alive. Might he not himself have contrived it?" Holmes's eyes flashed. "An excellent suggestion, Inspector, and for that reason we must hear his account in full, along with that of every servant and caller. If Mr. Venn be actor as well as musician, his testimony may conceal more than it reveals." He snapped his case shut. "Come! The scent of this puzzle lies not only in wax and brass, but in words and omissions." We were conducted to a drawing-room where 3 figures awaited under the constable's watch. First was Alistair Venn, a tall man with a mane of curling hair and fingers long and pale, as if born to coax sound from strings. He looked aggrieved, pacing with the nervous energy of a performer kept from his stage. Beside him sat Jervis the butler, immovable as a carved idol, and next to him a thin young woman in maid's uniform, this evidently the one who had remarked upon the odour of violets. Holmes addressed Venn first, with his customary courtesy edged by steel. "You were the last to see Sir Percival alive, or rather his semblance. Relate the moment precisely, leaving nothing unspoken." Venn drew himself up with theatrical solemnity. "I arrived at the appointed time, 10 o'clock. The fog lay heavy, and I confess I was delayed, but I entered by the salon door. From there one has a clear view of the study's outer panel. The candle upon his desk burned brightly, and between its flame and the door sat the master himself, head inclined, pen in hand. His shadow lay clean and full upon the panel, a black outline that moved faintly with each breath. I knocked gently, unwilling to disturb him. When no answer came, I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. I called for Jervis, and together we forced entry. To my horror, he was already cold. I swear to you, gentlemen, I saw life in that shadow." Holmes regarded him keenly. "Did you see the pen move? Did you hear the scratch of nib upon paper?" Venn faltered. "No, I cannot claim that. Only the impression of breath, of presence. I know the tricks of light, sir, but this was no phantom of the eye. It was real." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed! And yet you are a musician, skilled in rhythm and illusion, able to summon emotion by unseen vibrations. Is it not possible that you, more than another, could mistake suggestion for reality?" Venn flushed, his hands tightening upon one another. I resent the implication, sir. I am no liar. Nor have I called you one, Holmes replied smoothly. I merely ask you to consider how easily a man of artistic temperament may be swayed by artistry and crime. He turned abruptly. Now the maid. The young woman rose, twisting her apron. It was just before dinner, sir, when I set down a tray. I smelt it then, that scent, like powder but sweet. I told Mrs. Harkins, the housekeeper, but she said it must be the master's pomade, yet I swear I never smelt it here before. Orris root, Holmes murmured, a common ingredient in cosmetics, often used to mask less pleasant odours. You did well to notice, my girl. He studied her a moment longer, then dismissed her gently. Jervis, what of your master's habits? Did he lock his study as a rule? Never, sir, said the butler gravely. The door stood always open until tonight. He feared no man in his own house. Then who possessed the key found in his pocket? Only Sir Percival himself, sir. He wore it upon a chain. None of the staff held a copy. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Interesting. A locked door from within, a key in the dead man's pocket, and yet one insists he never locked it. This chain, where is it? Still upon his waistcoat, sir. The constable removed nothing. Holmes stood very still, as if listening to some faint melody only he could hear. At last he spoke. We must see the body once more, Watson. There is an answer hidden not in these words, but in the dead man's garments. Lestrade grunted. You'll not rest, will you, till you've turned him over thrice? Holmes smiled faintly. Twice is often sufficient, Inspector. Thrice is indulgence. Come. We descended to a small chamber where Sir Percival's body had been laid out upon a divan, a sheet covering his form. Holmes bent with tender precision, examining the chain that held the key. It was of silver, but I noticed as he did that one link bore a fresh mark, bent as though forced. He probed further, withdrawing from the pocket not only the key itself, but also a minute trace of blue like a smear of paint, clinging to its edge. Holmes straightened, holding it aloft in triumph. Watson, observe. The same grease as upon the calling-card tray. The key was not placed here by Sir Percival's hand, but after his death by one who bore traces of theatrical disguise. Our murderer wished us to believe the room sealed, the time of death fixed, the master alive until the hour of 10. But see, every illusion betrays its maker. Lestrade rubbed his chin. So Pike, the actor fellow, comes back into play. Perhaps, Holmes said softly, but let us not yet applaud the villain before the curtain rises. We must seek the stage trick which made a corpse cast breath, and for that, Watson, I suspect we must look not to the study alone, but to the house's very fabric. Come, we have seen shadows. Now let us search for the light that made them. Holmes led the way back up the stair, his stride swift and assured, though his eyes never ceased their restless survey of the house as we passed through. He paused more than once to glance at the sconces, at the arrangement of mirrors, and the narrow line of draught that crept beneath certain doors. It was as though he sought not merely the clues of murder, but the architecture itself, as if the very walls conspired in the crime. When at last we re-entered the study, the candle still guttering faintly in its holder, Holmes at once extinguished the flame and turned down the gas. Now, gentlemen, he said, in a voice low and intent, let us reproduce the conditions of that evening. Sir Percival sat at this desk. The candle burned here. Mr. Venn stood yonder in the salon, the door closed, and yet he beheld what he swore was a living outline of the baronet bent at his writing. Observe. He placed himself at the desk, leaning slightly forward, his thin frame outlined by the dim light of the street lamp which seeped through the curtained window. Then, with a flick of a match, He lit the candle once more and adjusted its position. The flame cast his silhouette upon the walnut panels of the study door. From where I stood near Lestrade, it was indeed a strong and lifelike outline. Yet Holmes abruptly shifted, withdrawing a lantern from his coat, a dark lantern, the shutters closed. With deft fingers he opened it a crack and directed its concentrated beam against the panel, reinforcing and enlarging the shadow in uncanny fidelity. "There," he cried softly. "Do you see the trick?" A lantern concealed within the desk, its light aligned with the candles, could reproduce the silhouette of a seated figure even when that figure no longer breathed. A criminal with knowledge of the stage could employ painted cloth or a simple cutout, placed upon the chair for a moment, to deceive an observer at the door. The candle served as decoy, the lantern as the true artificer of the shadow. Lestrade whistled under his breath. "By Jove, it's devilish clever, and you think our theatrical rogue carried such a lantern?" Holmes snapped the shutters closed and restored the room to darkness, save for the candle. The scorched panel tells me it was so. Chemical light, perhaps, or magnesium powder, enough to throw a vivid outline and then vanish. The wax spatter, Watson, was the remnant of that sudden glare, scattering melted residue across the blotter, not the candle's work, but a more violent flame. I felt a chill, for the ingenuity was both simple and fiendish. To think of a dead man propped like a puppet, his life mocked by a phantom image, made my skin crawl. And the purpose, Holmes? Why go to such elaborate ends? To control time, my dear fellow. Every crime has its theatre, and time is the prompter's bell. If the world believes Sir Percival lived until 10, the true interval of his death lies concealed. That interval may absolve the guilty, if only they can sustain the illusion. Holmes's eyes glinted as he turned to Lestrade. "We must know precisely where each person stood during the critical hour, the servants, the niece, the musician, the secretary. A crime built on alibi is like a house of cards. Remove one, and all falls. Let us begin with the secretary." The young man, Mr. Charles Fenton, was brought in at once. He was pale and scholarly, spectacles perched upon a thin nose, his hands ink-stained. He bowed nervously and clutched a sheaf of papers as if they were a shield. Holmes regarded him with one of those sudden, piercing stares which seemed to strip a man to the bone. "You managed Sir Percival's correspondence, Mr. Fenton?" "Yes, sir. Every evening he dictated a number of letters which I would prepare. Tonight, however, he bade me leave before dinner. He said he would write alone." "That was unusual?" Fenton hesitated. "Extremely. Sir Percival trusted no one to transcribe his private dealings, yet he never wrote them in his own hand." His fingers ached with rheumatism. Holmes leaned forward. "And did you see him alive after dinner?" "No, sir. I left at 7:30. I intended to return in the morning with the completed accounts." Holmes tapped his fingers. "Strange, then, that a man who disliked writing should spend his last hour at the desk, alone with pen and candle. Thank you, Mr. Fenton. That will do." The secretary withdrew, leaving behind an impression of unease. Holmes turned sharply to Lestrade. "You see, Inspector, each testimony points the same way. The butler insists his master never locked the study, yet tonight he was found within a sealed chamber. The secretary swears Sir Percival seldom wrote unaided, yet we are told he spent his last moments bent in composition, and the musician asserts he saw life in shadow when death had already claimed the man. Such contradictions do not arise from chance." Lestrade grunted. "So you'd have me haul in Pike, would you? This actor fellow with the orphan's scheme?" "In time, yes. But first we must lay hands on the apparatus of illusion. Without it, Pike will laugh at us as an enemy laughs at shadows. Let us search this desk." Together we emptied the drawers. Amidst the ordinary litter of pens and letters, Holmes drew forth a small tin container, scorched along one side. Within clung a residue of grey ash, faintly acrid. He sniffed it lightly. Magnesium filings, and see, the interior rim bears a smear of blue pigment, the very grease paint our maid observed. Our criminal rehearsed here, concealed his lamp within this tin, and scattered the residue in haste. He held it aloft, triumphant. This, Lestrade, is the missing voice of the play. Now we must find its player. It was near midnight when we emerged once more into the fog. Holmes's features were sharper than ever, his energy unflagging. He drew his coat tight and hailed a cab. Back to Baker Street, Watson. The night's labour is not yet done. With lamp, wax, and shadow, we can reconstruct the murderer's stage, and once I know how the curtain fell, the name of its author will follow as surely as the echo of a chord follows the stroke of a bow. The hansom rattled through the fog, carrying us swiftly back toward Baker Street, but Holmes scarcely stirred. His long, lean figure was folded in silence, the thin lips pressed together, the hawk-like profile cut in shadow against the cab's lantern. I could tell he was deep within that mental process which he once described as the clearing of the stage before the final act. I knew better than to disturb him, so I contented myself with watching the murk roll past the windows until at last we reached our familiar quarters. Once inside, Holmes cast aside his coat and immediately drew from the shelf several volumes of reference, chemical treatises, monographs on stage illusion, and a battered folio of theatrical mechanics. He set them open about the table, then drew the small tin of scorched magnesium from his pocket and set it before him as a relic at the centre of some arcane rite. With his delicate forceps, he lifted a flake of residue, holding it close to the flame of the lamp. The ash sparked faintly blue, confirming his suspicion. "Just as I thought, Watson," he said at last, his voice low but vibrant with conviction. "A mixture of magnesium filings and a tincture of copper salts. The result is a brilliant flash of white, tinged with blue and accompanied by a sudden spatter of molten debris. It is precisely this which imitated the candle's play and projected a convincing silhouette, a trick beloved of stage conjurers and of rogues with theatrical training." I leaned closer, fascinated despite the hour. "Then you are certain the death occurred earlier than Venn's testimony would suggest?" "Certain," he replied. "Sir Percival was dead long before 10. The shadow was conjured, not lived. Which leads us, my dear fellow, to a most pressing question. Who required that alibi? Who among those present could profit by the world believing Sir Percival breathed his last at 10 o'clock, and not at, say, 9:30? Before I could attempt an answer, Holmes had risen and begun to pace, his dressing gown flaring like a banner in the lamplight. "Consider, Watson. Mr. Venn the musician, his movements are innocent enough, for he entered only at the hour appointed. The niece, Miss Ashe, is bound by affection more than gain, though sentiment has been known to disguise darker motives. The secretary, Fenton, left at 7:30, and if Sir Percival had died shortly thereafter, suspicion might easily fall upon him. Yet he was dismissed by the victim himself, no less. That fact intrigues me. Why should Sir Percival, so dependent upon dictation, send away his amanuensis to write alone? Unless he expected another caller, one he did not wish Fenton to witness." Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing, as if he could already see the phantom visitor crossing the threshold of the study. He turned suddenly toward me. "Watson, do you recall Miss Ashe's mention of Godfrey Pike, the theatrical man denied his scheme? Here is a fellow of stage training, quick to anger, desperate for money. He possesses precisely the skill to contrive this shadow play, and what is more, he had cause to hate the baronet who exposed his imposture. I would wager my violin, Watson, that Pike's hand lies heavy upon this business." At that instant there came a sharp rap at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered, flustered. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent." She handed Holmes a card. Upon it, scrawled in bold strokes, was the name Godfrey Pike. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that predatory light I had come to know. "So the fly walks into the web of his own accord," he murmured. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." Moments later, the man himself strode into our sitting-room. He was of middle height, robust in figure, with a florid face and theatrical whiskers that seemed to belong to the footlights rather than the fog. His attire was flamboyant, an overcoat lined with velvet, cuffs faintly dusted with powder, and upon one sleeve, so faint as to escape the casual glance, a smear of blue. Holmes bowed courteously. "Mr. Pike, you come at a late hour." "I had no choice, sir," the man replied, his voice carrying the resonant timbre of the stage. "My name is bandied already in whispers about Sir Percival's death. I have enemies, sir, enemies who would destroy me with vile insinuations. I beg of you to clear me." Holmes's expression betrayed no emotion, though I, watching keenly, observed the minute tightening of his fingers upon the arm of his chair. "And why should suspicion fall upon you, Mr. Pike?" "Because I quarrelled with the old man," Pike admitted, spreading his hands. "Yes, I went to him with a noble project, to bring the solace of art to the children of the poor. He scorned me, called me a mountebank, turned me from his house with words that cut like knives. I was angry, I confess, but murder, no, sir. I am guilty only of passion." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze fixed like a gimlet. "Then tell me, Mr. Pike, where were you between 8:30 and 10 this evening?" The man shifted uneasily. "At my lodgings rehearsing lines. I live alone, Mr. Holmes. There is no one to vouch for me." Holmes's smile was almost imperceptible. "Indeed? Then perhaps you will indulge me further. Do you possess a lantern, sir, a dark lantern such as an actor might employ in certain illusions?" Pike's face flushed. "A lantern? Many men do. I own one, yes, but for ordinary purposes only." Holmes rose suddenly, crossing to the lamp and holding aloft the flake of blue-stained ash he had preserved. "Then perhaps, sir, you can also explain why the same pigment that adorns your cuff is found upon the apparatus used to produce a false shadow in Sir Percival's study, a shadow which deceived an innocent musician and concealed a death already accomplished." For a moment Pike's bluster faltered. His eyes darted from Holmes to me, then to the door. But Holmes was upon him in an instant, one lean hand gripping his wrist. "Not so, Mr. Pike. Flight will not serve you. The theatre of crime is ended, and the curtain has already begun to fall. You may remain silent if you choose, but the truth will speak louder than you." Pike sagged, his shoulders dropping as though the weight of the stage had been lifted from him. Yet in his eyes there flickered something fierce, not quite resignation, but not wholly guilt either. "You are clever, sir," he muttered, "but perhaps too clever. There are truths in this matter you do not yet perceive." Holmes regarded him coldly. "Then pray, sir, enlighten me, if you can." But Pike only set his jaw, refusing further speech. Holmes released him with a gesture, and Lestrade, who had joined us by arrangement, stepped forward to take him into custody. As the door closed behind them, Holmes stood silent, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed upon the empty chair where Sir Percival had once sat. At length he spoke in a tone of quiet certainty. "He is guilty of much, Watson. But whether he is guilty of murder, that remains to be seen. For in every well-written play the villain appears early, Yet the true author of the tragedy is often revealed only at the final act, and I suspect this play has one act more to run. The room had scarcely regained its silence after Pike's removal, when Holmes dropped into his chair, his long fingers pressed against his temple, his eyes closed as though he were a violinist listening for a note gone sour. I knew better than to interrupt his reverie, though my own mind was in turmoil. Pike's presence, his blue-smeared cuffs and his blustering manner seemed enough to satisfy Lestrade, yet Holmes's final words echoed in me with disquiet. Whether he is guilty of murder, that remains to be seen. After some minutes he stirred, his eyes opening with that sudden brightness which told me his thoughts had gathered to a point. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the look in Pike's eyes? A man cornered, yes, but not the desperate glare of one whose life is at stake. Rather, it was the indignation of an actor accused of playing a part badly. There is guilt in him, but of what kind?" "You believe he did not strike the fatal blow?" I ventured. "I believe," Holmes answered, rising once more to pace the hearthrug, "that he lent his knowledge to the staging of the death, but perhaps not to its cause. There is a distinction, and it is a vital one. A man may provide illusion without committing murder, yet illusion in crime is as damning as the act itself, for it shields the true culprit." He snatched up his violin and drew the bow across the strings with sharp insistence, a dissonant chord that startled me. "We must return to first. Principles. The man is found dead, locked within his study. The shadow deceives us into believing him alive later than he was. Pike has skill to contrive such deception, but what of the death itself? Was it heart failure, as the physician first claimed, or was there an unseen hand at work? I recalled the body lying so still upon the divan, the bent chain of the key, and the faint smear upon the silver. "You suspect poison?" Holmes lowered the violin, his face grave. "The possibility is strong. The orris scent may have been employed to mask another odour. Yet we must not rely on conjecture. Tomorrow we shall demand a full post-mortem, but there is more pressing business this very night. If Pike did not kill, then someone else did, and used him to set the scene. Who could that be, Watson? Who had opportunity between 7:30, when Fenton departed, and 9, when the clock was frozen? I considered the names: Jervis, the faithful butler; Miss Ashe, grieving but clear-eyed; the secretary, dismissed early, and perhaps others not yet revealed. Holmes seemed to read my thoughts, for he turned swiftly. "Exactly. The household is larger than those paraded for us. A housekeeper, perhaps, a footman, servants who move unseen. One of them may hold the missing piece. And then there is the matter of Sir Percival's papers. Why did he send away his secretary? What business did he conduct in solitude? Those letters may speak where men will not." At that instant, a knock came again upon our door, sharp and urgent. Mrs. Hudson entered, breathless. "A messenger, Mr. Holmes. He says it is from Belgrave Square. Miss Ashe begs you to come at once." Holmes took the slip of paper she offered. In a delicate but hurried hand was written, "I have discovered something among my uncle's effects. Come quickly. Lydia Ashe." Holmes seized his coat. "The play quickens, Watson. We shall return at once." Within the hour, we were again at Belgrave Square, the fog hanging like a pall over the great houses. Miss Ashe received us in the library, pale but composed, holding a small bundle of papers tied with ribbon. "I dared not show these before the inspector," she whispered. "They were hidden beneath the false bottom of my uncle's desk drawer. See?" Holmes untied the ribbon with care, spreading the sheets upon the table. They were letters, written in a bold, angular hand. As he scanned them, his brows rose. "Remarkable," Watson observed. "The correspondence is not philanthropic. As Sir Percival's reputation suggested, these are demands for money, thinly veiled threats from men of ill repute in the music halls. And here, this one is signed G.P. Could that not be our Mr. Pike? Miss Ashe clasped her hands. I feared as much. My uncle must have paid him at times for fear of exposure. He was generous, but his honour was fierce. Perhaps he sought to end it, and this is the consequence. Holmes tapped the paper with a long finger. Perhaps, but mark this, the dates. The last demand came 3 days past, yet Sir Percival arranged his affairs tonight, dismissed his secretary, and prepared to write alone. Why? Unless he expected to meet the threat head-on. He leaned back, the glimmer of triumph in his eyes. Do you not see, Watson? Pike may have come intending intimidation, not murder. Yet another, more calculating, seized the moment. Someone with access to the desk, knowledge of the key, and reason to wish the precise hour disguised. The shadow play was the mask, but behind it lies a different hand. Miss Ashe's voice trembled. Do you mean someone in this house? Holmes gave her a steady look. It is always wisest, Miss Ashe, to begin our search nearest the victim. Trust that we shall not rest until the truth is unveiled. For now, these letters are invaluable. Guard them well, but say nothing to Lestrade. His net closes too readily around the first bird it finds. As we left the library, Holmes pressed my arm. Watson, tomorrow we must examine every servant's movement and most of all Fenton's. The secretary's dismissal troubles me. Why should a man who hates to write insist on privacy unless the visitor expected was unwelcome to another? There is something of the tragic in Sir Percival's end, but also something of calculation. We have entered the penultimate act, Watson, and soon the curtain must rise upon the true villain. Holmes was uncommonly silent as we rode back through the midnight fog, the bundle of letters secure in his pocket. I could tell his mind was circling them as a hawk circles prey, tightening its arc with every turn. He leaned forward in the cab, fingers steepled, his gaze fixed upon nothing, and only once did he speak during that rattling journey. Watson, the signature G.P. may indeed stand for Pike, yet I suspect it is a mask rather than a confession. To a cunning hand, initials are the easiest of false trails. He sank back once more, and no more words passed between us until Baker Street received us again. There, Holmes lit his pipe and sat in the great armchair, the smoke wreathing about him as if even the air wished to hide its secrets. He laid the letters across his knees, tapping the edge of one against his long forefinger. Consider, Watson, Pike is hot-blooded, prone to bluster and desperate for funds. He is the very man to write a letter of demand, but not the man to contrive a locked-room masquerade of such delicacy. He would strike openly, and his passion would betray him. No, these letters are the work of another mind, one that knew Pike's quarrel and made use of his reputation. It is a dangerous trick to wield another man's name as one wields a dagger, knowing suspicion will point the wrong way. I leaned forward. Then Pike may be guilty of conspiracy, but not of murder? Holmes smiled faintly. Precisely. His hands are soiled by artifice, but perhaps not by blood. Yet we must be cautious. He has played some part, and whether willingly or unwittingly, he must be pressed until every shadow flees. He rose suddenly and paced the room with quick, jerky steps. The true question is this: what did Sir Percival intend tonight? He dismissed his secretary, prepared his desk, and awaited someone. Was it Pike? If so, then why is there no evidence of struggle, no trace of forced entry? Sir Percival knew his visitor, admitted him, and then died within minutes. That fact, Watson, is the fulcrum of the case. The next morning, Holmes was up before me. I found him already dressed, the letters spread once more upon the table. His violin lay untouched, the breakfast cooling on the tray. He looked up with that peculiar light which always set my heart racing, for it meant the chase was nearing its climax. Come, Watson, we must return to Belgrave Square. The servants' accounts will give us the missing intervals of time, and I would speak again with Mr. Fenton. His role troubles me. At Belgrave Square, Lestrade was already strutting about with the air of a man certain he had his quarry. He greeted us with a self-satisfied smile. "We've Pike under lock and key, Mr. Holmes. The Crown will have no difficulty with this one. The letters alone will see him through." Holmes's face betrayed nothing, though I detected the faintest tightening at the corners of his mouth. "And yet, Inspector, have you asked yourself why a man skilled in the theatre would leave his costume upon his sleeve and his signature upon a paper? Villains, Lestrade, seldom shout their names from the stage. They prefer the whisper in the wings." Lestrade frowned, but said nothing, and Holmes requested the servants be assembled. One by one they gave their accounts. The cook had seen nothing, the footman had been below stairs, the housekeeper occupied with linen. At last Jervis stood before us once more, impassive as stone. Holmes regarded him with a penetrating gaze. "You have served Sir Percival many years, Jervis. You knew his habits better than most. Tell me, did he often send away his secretary to write alone?" "Never, sir," Jervis said without hesitation. "It was most unusual. I remarked upon it to the housekeeper. He seemed troubled, if I may say so." "And after the secretary left, who entered the study before Mr. Venn arrived?" "No one, sir. The door remained closed. I passed by twice in my duties, and all was quiet." Holmes leaned forward. "And yet the bell-pull was cut. A man does not sever his only means of summoning aid unless—" He broke off, his eyes narrowing. "Jervis, did you notice whether the bell was working earlier in the day?" The butler's composure faltered for the first time. I cannot say, sir. It may have been defective." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Or cut long before the evening, to ensure Sir Percival could not summon help once the deed began. That is significant." Miss Ashe was then brought forward once more. She confirmed that her uncle had appeared resolute, almost grim, when she took her leave at dusk. "He said to me, 'Tonight ends it, Lydia.' I asked him what he meant, but he would not explain." Holmes bowed gravely. "Your memory serves us well, Miss Ashe." He expected a confrontation indeed. As she withdrew, Holmes turned abruptly toward Fenton, who stood pale at the threshold. "Mr. Fenton, will you join us? A question or two only. You say you left at 7:30, dismissed by your master. Did he specify why he required solitude?" Fenton shifted uneasily. "He said only that he must see to a private matter. He seemed determined. I did not press him." Holmes stepped closer, his voice soft but commanding. "And yet, Mr. Fenton, in your haste, you left behind a blotter inked with your own hand. I examined it last night. Tell me, what words did you write, then tear away? For the impression remains faint but legible." He produced a sheet from his pocket. The words, "He knows. Tonight will end it." That was your line, was it not? Fenton's face drained of colour. He stammered, Sir Percival dictated it, sir. He bade me write those words as if in preparation for some correspondence. I did not understand them." Holmes's voice cut like a knife. "Or perhaps you understood all too well. A secretary is more than a servant. He is a keeper of secrets, and secrets, Watson, can be fatal." There was a silence heavy enough to press the air from the room. Lestrade bristled, but Holmes lifted a hand to forestall him. "Not yet, Inspector. The play is not ended. We must uncover not only who wielded the knife of illusion, but who struck the silent blow of death. Tonight, Watson, we shall return to the study under cover of darkness, for there is one experiment yet to perform, and when it is done, the shadow shall give up its master. The fog lay thicker than ever that evening, muffling the rattle of carriage wheels and softening the glow of the lamps into pale orbs that seemed to float in the gloom. Holmes had insisted we dine early, though he scarcely touched his plate, his thoughts already fixed upon the experiment he had promised. By 9 o'clock we were again at Belgrave Square, the sombre house looming like a stage awaiting its players. Lestrade, though sceptical, had agreed to admit us, muttering about Holmes's taste for theatricals. Yet even his brusque air could not conceal the nervous energy that hung about the place. The servants had retired, Miss Ashe was absent, and the corridors echoed with that peculiar hush that belongs only to houses where death still lingers. Holmes moved at once to the study, his every step charged with intent. "We must reconstruct the precise conditions of the crime, Watson," he said. "But tonight we shall add one element, the truth that has thus far been hidden beneath illusion." He directed Lestrade to extinguish the Yuba gas lamps, leaving only the faint spill of moonlight through the curtains. Then, with delicate care, he lit the stub of beeswax candle, setting it upon the desk in the very holder where Sir Percival had placed it on his last night. The flame flickered, casting a modest glow. "Now," Holmes murmured, "we introduce the deception." From within his coat he produced the scorched tin we had discovered, now carefully cleaned. He set within it a prepared mixture of magnesium shavings, adjusting the wick of the lantern he had contrived for the purpose. "Stand in the salon doorway, Watson, observe the panel, and tell me what you see." I obeyed, placing myself where Venn had stood. The candle's modest flame threw Holmes's outline clearly upon the panel as he bent forward at the desk. Then suddenly he opened the lantern and released a brief, startling glare. The shadow leapt to full, vivid life, larger and darker, quivering with uncanny fidelity. For a moment I could have sworn the man before me breathed. Even knowing it was Holmes, a chill ran through me, and I understood at last how Venn had been so deceived. "Excellent!" Holmes cried, snapping the shutters closed. "Do you see, Lestrade? With such a contrivance a corpse might appear to write, though cold as stone. Pike could construct it, yes, but he was not here at the vital hour. He was used, his skill borrowed. The true culprit required his knowledge and then cast him aside like an empty costume. The trick was not the murder, but the masquerade which cloaked its timing." Lestrade scratched his head. "I'll grant you, it's clever. But it don't tell us who slipped the poison, if poison it was, nor who wanted the man dead. Pike still looks the likeliest to me." Holmes shook his head, his eyes bright with the fire of discovery. "Not so. Pike's motives were too shallow. He raged, yes, but he lacked the intimacy of knowledge, the habit of the study, the awareness of Sir Percival's reliance on his secretary, the foresight to cut the bell-pull long before. This crime was hatched within the household, Inspector, not without." He turned to me suddenly. "Watson, do you recall the bent chain upon which the key hung? That link was forced, suggesting the key had been tampered with after death. Now consider who had daily access to his garments, who might handle his effects unnoticed. The butler, the secretary, perhaps the niece. But Miss Ashe's presence of mind and distress ring true. She revealed the letters when concealment would have protected her. No, it is not she." His gaze grew sharp. "Fenton, then. The man whose livelihood depended upon Sir Percival's trust, who might dread dismissal if some irregularity in the accounts were uncovered. What if these letters were not only threats to Sir Percival, but also to his secretary, who feared discovery of his own fraud? The words Watson read from the blotter, "He knows, tonight will end it," speak as much of the secretary's resolve as the master's. I started, for the reasoning struck me with its terrible clarity. "You believe Fenton poisoned him?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, and with subtlety. a draught of claret, perhaps laced with some agent without strong taste, offered at dinner. Sir Percival's heart failed swiftly thereafter. Fenton had but to arrange matters, relying upon Pike's trick to shield him from suspicion. Once Sir Percival fell, the study was sealed, the shadow prepared, and the musician brought to bear false witness of the hour. At that moment a step was heard in the corridor, and Fenton himself appeared, pale and drawn, carrying a bundle of documents. He started to see us gathered, the candle casting uncanny shapes upon the walls. Holmes's eyes fixed upon him with merciless precision. "Ah, Mr. Fenton," he said softly, "how fitting that you should arrive just as we speak of you. Have you brought us another letter, perhaps signed G.P.?" Fenton faltered, the papers slipping from his grasp. "Aye, these are Sir Percival's accounts. I thought Inspector Lestrade asked for them." His voice quavered, and his eyes darted from Holmes to the glaring tin upon the desk. Holmes stepped forward. "Your hand betrays you, sir. You forged those letters to cast suspicion on Pike, knowing his quarrel would serve your ends. You cut the bell pull to ensure no summons could be made, and you poisoned your master's wine, trusting the deception of a shadow to give you the time you required. Deny it if you can, but the evidence mounts like bricks in a wall." Fenton's face twisted, first with terror, then with sudden, reckless defiance. "You have no proof," he cried. "The old man was weak, his heart ready to fail. Pike quarrelled with him. Pike knew the trick. I am innocent." Holmes's voice was low, yet it carried the force of a judge's sentence. "Innocent men do not prepare false letters, Mr. Fenton, nor do they tremble at the mention of the very means they employed. You sought to hide behind Pike's flamboyance, but the shadow has betrayed you. And tomorrow, when the post-mortem reveals the poison, your guilt will be written as plainly as ink upon paper." Fenton staggered back, his mouth working soundlessly. Lestrade stepped forward at last, placing a heavy hand upon his shoulder. "I think we'll hear the rest of this at the Yard, Mr. Fenton. You'll find the inspector's room less forgiving than Mr. Holmes's parlour." As the secretary was led away, Holmes stood silent, the candlelight dancing upon his sharp features. At length he turned to me, his expression grave. "The game draws to its close, Watson, yet we must tread carefully. For though I am convinced of Fenton's guilt, there remains one question unanswered. Why did Sir Percival dismiss him at all? Did he suspect? Did he know? The dead man holds that answer still, and until we uncover it, the case remains incomplete." The next morning broke grey and heavy with rain, and the melancholy weather seemed to weigh upon the very stones of Baker Street. Holmes was already awake when I descended, a telegram open before him, and his eyes glinting with that peculiar sharpness which only appeared when his mind had pierced a veil others did not yet see. He motioned me to the table without preamble, his long fingers drumming lightly against the telegram. "Watson, the post-mortem has confirmed what I already suspected. Sir Percival's heart did not fail of its own accord. A trace of digitalis, in concentration far exceeding the therapeutic, was found within his stomach. He was poisoned. There can be no doubt now that we deal with murder." I felt a grim satisfaction at the certainty, for Holmes's chain of reasoning had long convinced me of foul play, though some part of me had still hoped the poor man's death might be natural. Holmes rose and paced the floor, the telegram still between his fingers. "Digitalis, Watson, easy to administer, difficult to trace without modern chemical assay, and cruelly suited to mimic heart failure. Who but a man with access to Sir Percival's daily draughts or to his wine at table could have administered it? Fenton alone had the intimacy, and Fenton alone stood to lose everything should Sir Percival discover his treachery." I recalled the secretary's pale face, his trembling hands and his sudden fury when Holmes accused him. "Then it is settled," I said. "Fenton is the murderer. The law will have its case, and justice will be done." Holmes halted abruptly and turned upon me with that rare intensity which could make even the most certain conclusion seem fragile. "Not so fast, my dear Watson. There remains a thorn in the fabric, and until it is plucked, the garment may yet unravel. Consider this. Sir Percival dismissed Fenton unusually early, before dinner. Why? If he suspected his secretary's dishonesty, why permit him to handle the accounts at all? Why not confront him then and there? Instead, Sir Percival sent him away, remained alone, and prepared for a visitor. That dismissal troubles me. It suggests that the baronet's suspicions were fixed upon another. I hesitated. You mean upon Pike? Holmes shook his head. Perhaps. Yet what if Sir Percival knew of the forged letters, suspected they came not from Pike but from one closer to him, and wished to settle the matter privately? If so, then the scene shifts again. Fenton may have forged the letters, yes, but that does not prove he gave the poison. Another hand may have taken advantage of the opportunity, a hand we have not yet fully considered. At that moment there was a knock upon the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a card. Holmes read it, his brows lifting. "Miss Lydia Ashe, show her in." The young lady entered, her face pale, but her bearing steady. In her hand she held a folded sheet. "Mr. Holmes, I found this last night among my uncle's effects, hidden within his Bible. I fear it may shed a darker light upon the case." She handed the paper to Holmes, who unfolded it with care. It was a letter in Sir Percival's own hand, the ink smudged as though written hastily. "To be opened in the event of my death. I have reason to believe one within my household plots against me. If harm should befall me, let the truth be sought not among my enemies abroad, but among those I trust too dearly at home." Holmes's eyes gleamed as he read the words aloud. "There, Watson. Confirmation that Sir Percival expected danger, not from Pike, not from nameless rogues, but from his own household. It aligns with every inference we have made. But which of them? The butler, loyal yet secretive? The secretary, cornered by debt? Or—" He glanced swiftly at Miss Ashe, whose lips trembled as though she feared his next words. "Even one of his kin?" Miss Ashe pressed a hand to her heart. "No, Mr. Holmes. My uncle was stern but just. I loved him dearly. Do not look to me." Holmes softened his tone. "Forgive me, Miss Ashe. It is my duty to doubt all until the truth emerges, but you may assist me greatly. Tell me, did you observe any alteration in your uncle's health these last weeks? Any sudden weakness, dizziness, or disturbance?" She thought for a moment. "Yes, he complained often of faintness after his evening wine. I urged him to consult a physician, but he dismissed my concern. He said only that he was weary." Holmes's face hardened. "That wine, Watson? It was the vehicle of death, and who poured it? Jervis, the butler, whose hand carried every glass to his master's table. He is loyal, yes, but loyalty can be worn as a mask. If Fenton forged the letters to divert suspicion, perhaps it was Jervis who seized the deadlier role." Lestrade, who had entered unnoticed, exclaimed, "Then we'll clap the irons on the butler at once." But Holmes raised a hand. "Not yet, Inspector. The net must close upon the right fish, not the wrong. Jervis may have carried the glass, but did he mix its contents? I tell you, there is a deeper web here. Pike provided the shadow, Fenton the forgery, but another supplied the poison. 3 strands woven together. We must unravel which hand tied the knot." Holmes turned abruptly to Miss Ashe. "One last question. Did your uncle ever alter his will or speak of doing so?" She hesitated. "Why, yes. Only last week he told me he intended to leave the greater part of his estate to charity. I knew he had spoken of such before, but he seemed resolved this time. Holmes's eyes flashed. Ah, that, Watson, is the motive which clarifies all. For charity means disinheritance, and disinheritance breeds desperation. One within this house knew his fortune would slip away unless Sir Percival's hand was stilled. Poison, forgery, illusion, each was but a part of the plot. We stand now upon the threshold of revelation. He strode to the window, gazing into the rain-soaked street with that strange mixture of triumph and melancholy I had seen before in him, when the pattern of the crime had at last resolved in his mind. Tonight, Watson, we shall gather them all, the niece, the secretary, the butler, and yes, even Pike. For the time has come to strip away shadow and trickery. Before tomorrow's dawn, the true murderer will stand revealed. By late evening, the drawing-room of Belgrave Square had been transformed into a tribunal. The great lamps glowed upon gilt mirrors, casting reflections that seemed like silent witnesses, while the rain beat against the windows as though impatient for the curtain to rise. Holmes had demanded that every figure connected with the case be present, and so they were. Miss Lydia Ashe, pale and resolute, her hands tightly clasped. Jervis the butler, impassive, but with lines of strain about his mouth. Fenton the secretary, guarded by Lestrade's men, his spectacles slipping nervously down his nose. And finally, Pike, sullen and defiant, brought from custody at Holmes's insistence. Lestrade himself stood nearby, arms folded, though I could see that his bluster was tempered by curiosity. He knew Holmes too well to dismiss the staging of such a scene as mere theatrics. Holmes stood at the mantel, lean and hawk-like, his eyes darting from one to the other with that air of quiet authority which made even the guilty tremble. His violin rested against the chair, untouched, as though waiting for the final chord. At length he spoke, his voice calm, yet carrying to every corner of the room. We are gathered here, ladies and gentlemen, because shadows have been used to deceive us, but shadows cannot exist without light, and tonight we shall bring that light to bear until the truth is revealed. He turned first to Pike. You, sir, provided the trick of the false silhouette. Your skill in theatrical illusions was employed to convince us that Sir Percival lived beyond his true hour of death. Yet though you lent your knowledge, you did not wield the poison. You were but a tool, your quarrel with the baronet exploited by subtler minds. The forged letters in your name were meant to point the finger squarely at you. I do not absolve your part, but you are not the hand that killed. Pike's mouth opened as though to protest, but he sank back into silence, his defiance tempered by relief. Holmes's eyes shifted to Fenton, who shrank visibly under their gaze. And you, Mr. Fenton, forged those letters. You sought to deflect suspicion onto Pike, for you knew your own accounts would not bear scrutiny. The words you left upon your blotter, he knows. Tonight will end it. Betray your fear. Yet though you conspired in deceit, you too were not the final agent of death. Your guilt lies in cowardice and forgery, but not in murder. Fenton gasped, his hands trembling. But I swear... Holmes cut him off with a sharp gesture. Your protestations matter little. The evidence speaks louder than you. Still, even forgery cannot kill a man. Now Holmes's gaze fell upon Jervis, and a hush seemed to fall heavier than the storm outside. And so we come to you, Jervis. You have served Sir Percival for 20 years. None knew his habits better, none approached his table so closely. You alone poured his wine night after night. It was you who had the access, you who could administer the digitalis without detection. You cut the bell pull to ensure that no cry could summon aid, and you bent the chain upon his key to create the appearance of a sealed room. In loyalty, you clothed yourself, but in truth you acted from fear, the fear of disinheritance, for you knew your master intended his wealth for charity, and you, who had devoted your life to him, stood to be cast aside with nothing. Jervis's face remained carved of stone, but his lips pressed thin, and his eyes, dark and glistening, betrayed the storm within. Miss Ashe uttered a cry, rising from her seat. No, Jervis would never. He loved my uncle as a father. Holmes's voice softened, though it lost none of its certainty. Love is no shield against desperation, Miss Ashe. Devotion twisted by resentment may commit acts the heart would once abhor. Sir Percival's kindness was turned against him, for in choosing charity over legacy, he planted the seed of betrayal. For a moment no one spoke. Then Lestrade strode forward, his hand dropping heavily upon the butler's shoulder. "Jervis, you'll come with me. You've heard Mr. Holmes. It's as clear a case as any I've seen." But Holmes raised a hand once more. "One moment, Inspector. For though Jervis administered the poison, he did not act alone. There is yet another figure in this drama, unseen but vital. The very words of Sir Percival's hidden note warned us. Not among my enemies abroad, but among those I trust too dearly at home. Jervis was but the instrument. The mind that urged him, the whisper that fed his resentment, came from one who stood to gain most." He turned slowly, and every gaze followed his until it rested upon Lydia Ashe. Her face drained of colour, and she clutched the back of the chair as though to steady herself. "No," she whispered. "You cannot mean—" Holmes's eyes were inexorable. "And yet I do. Your uncle's change of will threatened not only the servant who loved him, but you, his nearest kin. You confessed yourself that he told you of his decision. You had motive, knowledge, and opportunity. It was you who suggested to Jervis that his devotion would go unrewarded, that the charities would swallow the estate. You fanned his fear, and when the moment came, you allowed him to bear the guilt of action. But your hand is in every detail, the concealment of the letters, the discovery of the note, the timing of the dismissal. You, Miss Ashe, orchestrated the tragedy from behind the curtain." She staggered back, her eyes wide with horror, then anger. "You twist everything. I loved my uncle. I sought only to protect him." Holmes stepped forward, his voice low but merciless. "Then why hide the letter until yesterday? Why not reveal it at once?" "Because it condemned you, Miss Ashe, not Pike, not Fenton, not even Jervis. Sir Percival's words were for you. He suspected, he knew. And when he said to you, 'Tonight ends it,' he meant to confront you with your own treachery. That confrontation you could not allow." Her composure shattered, and she sank into the chair, covering her face with her hands. A sob broke from her lips, half grief, half fury. Jervis uttered a low moan, as though the weight of years had fallen upon him, and turned his face aside. Holmes looked at Lestrade, who stood open-mouthed at the revelation. "You have your murderer, Inspector. The household was the stage, Pike the conjurer, Fenton the forger, Jervis the instrument, but the author of the play was Lydia Ashe. The shadow behind the candle flame was hers." Lestrade found his voice at last. "Well, I'll be damned! Miss Ashe, you are under arrest." As she was led away, the storm outside broke into thunder, rolling through the night like the closing bars of a tragic symphony. Holmes stood silent, his gaze fixed upon the dying flame of the candle upon the desk. At length he spoke, softly, almost to himself. "How strange, Watson, that the brightest light should cast the darkest shadow. Sir Percival's philanthropy bred resentment. his kindness drew betrayal, and the flame that lit his last hour illuminated the stage of his own undoing. The storm had passed by the following morning, leaving the streets washed clean, their stones gleaming beneath a pale autumn sun. Baker Street, though bustling with the usual rattle of carts and cries of vendors, seemed unusually calm after the turbulence of the case. I found Holmes seated at the breakfast table, the morning papers spread before him. Already the headlines carried the tale of Sir Percival Ashe's murder, sensationalizing the arrest of his niece, with lurid accounts of poison, forged letters, and candlelit illusions. Lestrade, the journalists reported, had untangled a most singular web, though I knew, and Holmes knew, that the true strands had been revealed by none other than the master of deduction himself. Holmes looked up from the paper, his expression one of weary amusement. "See, Watson? Already the world has simplified it into a morality play. The wicked niece, the faithful detective, the justice of the law. It is neat, but far from true. The matter was never so simple. Fenton's forgeries, Pike's illusions, Jervis's hand upon the glass. Each played their part, but the orchestration belonged to Lydia Ashe. It was not the act of poison alone, but the cunning use of others' weaknesses that marks her guilt. And such manipulation, my dear fellow, is often the most insidious form of crime." I could not help but feel a pang of pity for the young woman, though her guilt was plain. "And yet, Holmes, she seemed to waver even at the last." "Do you think remorse weighed upon her?" "Remorse," Holmes replied, stirring his coffee with absent care, "is often no more than the recognition that one's play has ended before the applause. She gambled her inheritance against her uncle's resolve, and lost. Still, I confess, there was a tragedy in it. She might have lived in comfort had she but trusted time rather than schemed against it. But human nature, Watson, seldom bears to see its fortune slip away." He rose and crossed to the window, his lean figure etched against the sunlight. The street below was alive with life, and yet Holmes seemed to look beyond it, into some distance only he could perceive. What strikes me most, however, is the poetry of it all. Death masked by light, a shadow used to mimic life, the betrayer hidden among the trusted. A man dies behind a candle flame, and the truth is revealed only when the flame gutters out. It is fitting in its way, almost theatrical. I smiled, despite the grim subject. "You have untangled another knot, Holmes, and once more Scotland Yard will reap the glory." Holmes gave a short laugh, sharp and without bitterness. "Let Lestrade enjoy his laurels. He plays his role well enough. My interest is not in headlines, but in the intellectual chase, to trace a thread of truth through a labyrinth of deception that, Watson, is the true reward. The law may hold Miss Ashe, but I hold the satisfaction of knowledge." He turned back to the table and took up his violin, tucking it beneath his chin. A soft, haunting strain filled the room, rising and falling like the echoes of the storm that had passed. I sat in silence, as I often did, content to listen, my mind turning over the events we had lived through. At last he lowered the bow and looked at me with that peculiar mix of irony and warmth which always made me marvel at the man. "Come, Watson, enough of death and shadows. The world will soon present us with another problem, equally baffling and equally absurd, and when it does, we shall be ready." And so the case of the death behind the candle flame was closed, leaving behind not only the memory of a tragic crime, but also the reminder that even in the quietest of rooms, behind the gentlest of lights, shadows may conceal the darkest of human designs.